Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for our AP Government Redesign Test Series as we start Part 1 of Federalism. In previous lessons, we looked at the debates that broke out at the Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions over state sovereignty versus national sovereignty, and the concept of federalism. And in this lesson, we will begin to see how that debate has lasted throughout the history of our republic. In 2003, the federal government entered the education arena, one that has traditionally been reserved to the states, as Congress and President George W. Bush passed the No Child Left Behind Act, which called for more standardized tests to hold schools, districts, and states accountable for student achievement. But the question was, who is in charge of public schools and education, the national government or the states? States that refused to participate in this program would lose federal funds towards education. And of course, most states, whether they wanted to participate or not, didn't want to lose that funding. In our next lesson, we're going to see how federal funds have really shaped the relationship between national and state sovereignty, especially in our modern age. The No Child Left Behind Act had bipartisan support when it was passed. But by 2015, after much criticism from the left and right, as political cartoonist Daryl Cagle depicts, we began to question the benefits of too much testing, and the bill was replaced. Unfortunately, not so much the testing. But the question over federal intrusion into state powers continues. Again, in our next lesson on federalism, we will look at this progression of state versus federal power throughout U.S. history. In part 1 of our lesson on federalism, we will focus on the constitutional clauses that impact the relationship between the national and state governments, and some of the issues that these have caused. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers by clicking the link below this video. So we were introduced to the concept of federalism, or a federal system of government, in our last lesson, and how the framers of the Constitution divided powers between the two levels. Again, federalism, or a federal system, is a government in which authority is divided between two sovereign levels of government, national and regional, in our case, state governments. Many governments across the globe use the federal system of government. And when we refer to systems of government, we're describing where power lies in those levels of government. The federal system created by the Constitution was supposed to place both levels on an even footing with different responsibilities. And we'll come back to see if they have truly remained equal. The federal system is different from what is known as a unitary system, like they have in England, in which the national government holds all or most of the power and delegates it to various regional governments, whether those be districts or city governments, but the national or central authority passes legislation and implements policy that affects the entire nation. We remember a confederal system from our nation's first government under the Articles of Confederation, in which the states held most of the power. There are very few confederal systems left. Maybe the closest modern example would be the European Union, which, as you know, isn't a national government, but a continental, mostly economic governing body. And as you can see from the Brexit debacle in England, national governments can decide whether to participate in this confederation or not. But back to the U.S. government. We talked about Madison in Federalist 51, who wrote about how the federal system provided another check on power. And while we aren't responsible for knowing these essays, Hamilton and Madison bring up the same concept in other Federalist papers, that the people can turn to either level for help or to keep the power of the other in check. So you need to keep track of the labels we use when listing the powers of the various levels. And we see that some powers are shared by both, and those are called concurrent powers. When talking about national powers, we use enumerated when we're talking about the power of the U.S. Congress, or expressed when talking about the national government in general, as in they are expressed in the Constitution. Sometimes you will see delegated, and when talking about presidential powers, the AP likes to use formal or informal, as in informal would be a power the president has that isn't listed in the Constitution, kind of like implied powers for the Congress. Finally, state powers are called reserve powers, and we will look at how this name came about in a minute. We previously looked at the enumerated powers of the U.S. Congress to declare war and maintain an army. And in our next lecture, we will look at how the national government has used its power to regulate interstate commerce to address a wide range of state issues. Some enumerated powers are shared with the states, like taxing, borrowing money, and creating courts. As we mentioned before, establishing and running public schools is traditionally a state or reserve powers, as are licenses, marriage, and election, as well as dealing with commerce that happens inside a state border, known as intrastate commerce. The Constitution does lay out some denied powers. For example, the national government cannot tax exports or pass what are called ex post facto laws, in which they pass a law and punish people after the fact for a crime they committed in the past. And state governments can't sign treaties with other nations or make their own money, both of which were problems under the Articles of Confederation. In Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, which outlines the relationship between the national and state governments, we find what is called the Full Faith and Credit Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause. The Full Faith and Credit Clause mandates that each state must respect each other's laws, and the Privileges and Immunity Clause says that states must treat citizens from other states the same as they treat their own. We saw the Full Faith and Credit Clause become an issue in the same-sex marriage debates. Remember, regulating marriage is a state power. In the 1990s, the issue of same-sex marriage became a national debate, as some states considered legalizing the practice, while others passed laws or state constitutional amendments banning the practice. The Congress, with the blessing of President Clinton, stepped in, passing what's usually referred to as DOMA, or the Defense of Marriage Act, defining marriage as a union between a man and a woman. In 2003, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize gay marriage, despite DOMA, and they were quickly followed by other states. So the question arose, under the Full Faith and Credit Clause, did states have to recognize marriages from other states? Political cartoonist John Cole addressed the issue with this couple getting married in New York, with the priest saying, "Till death or the Pennsylvania state line do you part." Two Supreme Court cases address this issue. One in 2013, known as U.S. v. Windsor, in which the widow of a same-sex couple living in New York, a state that recognized their marriage, was going to be taxed by the federal government after her wife left her estate to Windsor in her will, something spouses are able to do without federal taxes. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Windsor's favor, opening the door for a case known as Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, in which the court ruled that all states must recognize same-sex marriage, making DOMA null and void. So let's look at some other constitutional clauses and amendments impacting federalism. We mentioned before that state powers are known as reserve powers, and this comes from the 10th Amendment, which states that all powers not delegated to the U.S. government by the Constitution are reserved for the states. And again, those powers for Congress that are laid out in Article 1 of the Constitution are known as enumerated powers. We also discussed the Supremacy Clause, which states that federal laws and the U.S. Constitution are quote-unquote supreme when they contrast with state laws or constitution. And we also looked last time at the necessary and proper, aka the elastic clause, allowing Congress to pass laws in order to carry out its enumerated powers, creating what are known as implied powers. So we see the opening for debate. If the 10th Amendment says that all powers not delegated to the U.S. government by the Constitution are reserved for the states, Is the U.S. government allowed to create implied powers? This question arose early in our republic's history after Alexander Hamilton, who was President Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, created a national bank and laid the groundwork for our first must-know U.S. Supreme Court case for the AP. Hamilton's rival on Washington's cabinet was Secretary of State, future president, and author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, a rivalry which, thanks to the musical, many of my students seem to know more about. Jefferson was known as a strict constructionist. This is someone who believes that the U.S. government only has the power it was given by the U.S. Constitution. He lays out his view using the language of the 10th Amendment when he wrote that, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground," quote, "that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved," or as he put it, preserved, "to the states or to the people." The first Bank of the United States expired, but it was brought back as the second Bank of the United States under President James Madison, ironically because the author of the Federalist Papers had fallen into the Jefferson camp. And this led to our AP required case, McCulloch versus Maryland. After the state of Maryland passed a tax on a branch of the Bank of the United States located within its borders. The U.S. Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, whose name we will hear in another landmark case, ruled in favor of the national government. In the opinion of the court, Marshall stated that if the government has the power to tax, borrow, and coin money, it is implied under the Necessary and Proper Clause that they can create a bank. Also, since the Supremacy Clause makes federal law and the U.S. Constitution supreme over state laws, that the state of Maryland had no power to interfere, or in this case, tax a national institution. This was a major victory for the national government, and it solidified the implied powers concept. So let's take a look at the Supremacy Clause in a modern issue, the legalization of marijuana by several states. The distribution of marijuana is still a federal crime, and yet the national government has not cracked down on these state laws, even though they have the power under the Supremacy Clause. So does this mark a larger movement towards state sovereignty? Well, that'll be a major theme of our next lesson on federalism. But before we go there, let's review today's lesson. Define federalism. A government in which authority is divided between two sovereign levels of government, national and regional. This is a system of government in which the national government alone has ultimate sovereignty. Unitary. Madison and Hamilton argued that federalism would have this effect. It would be an additional check and balance on power. Congressional powers that are listed in the Constitution are known as, you gotta know this, enumerated or express powers. Which clause allows the federal or national government to stretch their powers? We've covered this a few times. The Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes known as the Elastic Clause. This same clause produces these types of powers. Implied powers. What amendment states that any powers not delegated or enumerated for the national government are left to the states? The 10th Amendment. This amendment produces this name for state powers, reserve powers. This clause mandates that states must recognize and respect other states' laws. The Full Faith and Credit Clause. What do we call national powers? Well, we have a lot of names: expressed, enumerated if we're talking about Congress, formal if we're talking about the president, or informal, and sometimes we use delegated. What do we call shared powers between the national and state governments? Concurrent powers. What Supreme Court case said that the federal government had the implied power to create a national bank? McCulloch versus Maryland. Marshall argued that these clauses of the Constitution gave the national government the power to overturn Maryland's practice. The Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clauses.